Welcome to everyone to the National Veterans for Peace Convention, our first online convention. Here it is on August 5th at 3 in the afternoon, and we're thrilled to have with us four panelists on working for peace on the Korean Peninsula. They are all specialists in some aspect of Korea, both North and South Korea, interestingly enough. Today, they will be talking about citizen advocacy programs in the US and in South Korea and even North Korea, and putting political pressure on governments for peace on the Korean Peninsula, 70 years after the horrific 3-year Korean War that began in 1950, in which over 4 million Koreans were killed, nearly 500,000 Chinese, and 330,000 US military and military from 20 other countries. 8 days ago, on July 27th, was the 67th anniversary of the armistice, not a peace treaty, that ended the military war. But the political wars continue. The Korea Peace Now network, of which Veterans for Peace, Korea Peace Campaign is a part, hosts the annual Peace for Korea Advocacy Days to educate the public and members of the US Congress of the need for diplomacy, not threats of war, to finally achieve peace on the Korean Peninsula. First, we will have a short video about the Korea War and work for peace. And thanks to Women Cross the DMZ, Christine Ahn, and Cody Aguave of the Quincy Institute for this video.
Okay, let's share the screen and
talks between North Korea and the United States over Pyongyang's nuclear weapons program have broken down again.
North Korea has blown up an inter-Korean liaison office building. The move comes as the United States and North Korea remain deadlocked on nuclear diplomacy.
A maximum pressure strategy of isolation and sanctions has failed. Today, there is no disarmament and there is no peace. But the risks of catastrophic war on the Korean Peninsula are accelerating. A war between the US and North Korea would put 30,000 US soldiers in harm's way immediately. A projected death toll approaching 300,000 within the first few days. If nuclear weapons were used, millions could die. Both Democratic and Republican administrations have been trying to convince North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons for years. But the strategy is flawed, because these attempts at diplomacy have happened in the context of a war that never ended. The Korean War was only ever halted, with no peace agreement, just an armistice for 70 years. America's focus and efforts to denuclearize North Korea have failed because the question of the Korean War hasn't been addressed. If war is the impediment, then pursuing an end-of-war declaration should be the first step to get to peace.
Many people talk about they want a denuclearized peninsula, and certainly that's great. That's a great objective to have. But until we're willing to give something to get something, until we're willing to go step by step and achieve some kind of sustainable peace, we're never going to have even the possibility of a denuclearized Korea.
Pursuing a peace agreement could help fix broken relations and reduce hostilities between Seoul and Pyongyang, because both sides agree it's desirable and in their interests.
Declaring the Korean War over may seem like an empty gesture to some, but it's more than symbol. Such a step could induce North Koreans to take more positive steps toward de-escalating tensions on the peninsula.
Pursuing peace is in America's strategic interest too, because it would strengthen South Korea, the US's ally.
South Korea is in a very unusual situation of basically relying on the US military for its security. A paradigm shift is needed in the US-South Korea relations toward a more independent South Korea that is less reliant on American security.
Pursuing peace would also reduce human suffering in North Korea.
North Korea is the most sanctioned country in the world. It impacts every aspect of their lives, whether their ability to access medicine, or even the ability of women who worked in textiles factories to be able to have a livelihood. So yes, a peace agreement with North Korea will actually drastically improve the day-to-day life of ordinary North Korean people.
And women peace builders are critical in helping to end the 70-year conflict.
Since the start of the Korean War, actually, as bombs were raining down on the Korean Peninsula, women have been on the front lines calling for peace. We have an essential voice. We have a critical voice that is absent right now, that is beyond just talking about nuclear weapons or missiles. Yes, these are things that impact everybody, but there are other ways that women are being impacted right now that need our perspective to ensure that a peace agreement is designed, but also one that truly leads to peace and security for everyone.
If the U.S. chooses to keep the same approach that's failed, the costs will keep piling up, and the risk of catastrophic war will remain an ever-present reality. A peace agreement could open another path to negotiations for nuclear disarmament on the Korean Peninsula. And in the U.S., there's growing congressional support for pursuing peace. It's time to end the Korean War and get to a peace agreement.
Thank you, Christine, for showing us that movie, being our technical guru on the webinar. Our very first panelist will be Tim SHORROCK. He's a journalist. He's an author of a very interesting book, Spies for Hire, The Secret World of Intelligence Outsourcing. He was raised in Japan and South Korea and has been working on national security issues since the 1970s. During the Vietnam War, he was active in peace and anti-war movement, and he writes frequently about the US military policies in Asia and the Korean Peninsula. He is one of the people that wrote about first the Gwangju massacre. He's written many investigative stories on issues around the world, and he's been published in The Nation and New York Times, lots and lots of outlets, and you see him frequently on a very favorite channel of ours, Democracy Now! Tim, we'd like to invite you to update us on what's happening on the Korean Peninsula, please.
Okay, well, thank you, and hello to all the Vets for Peace out there, and thank you for what you do. It's really great work you all do, and I really appreciate it. I just want to, I was asked to give kind of an overview, so I thought I just would start with, COVID-19, which we're all suffering through and all dealing with, and how North and South Korea are dealing with it. It's really isolated North Korea even more than it was, because they had to move pretty quickly to seal their border, and of course 99% of their border is with China. So that had an immediate effect on the North, and apparently they've done pretty well about fighting the virus. They claim there's been no cases until just the other day, which they blame on someone sneaking in from the south. But nevertheless, it's further isolated them very, very clearly, and that can't help in terms of helping the suffering of ordinary people there because of the sanctions. South Korea, as everybody knows, is following, even from the mainstream press, has done astonishingly well in handling the coronavirus, 500 times or more better than the US has. In fact, it's become kind of a model for the US, but still, it's like everybody else, like every place else, it's taking an economic toll. But they've been able to, control it, and when there's flare-ups like there are here all the time, they're able to, take care of it right away. So that's all good. One of the things about COVID that's shed some light on the role of the U.S. military, though, is how some of the newest cases in Japan and Okinawa, and then in South Korea, are by U.S. soldiers that come over there. And they don't have to go through the normal national clearance that you do to get into another country. They just fly in these U.S. planes, and some of them have brought COVID and they've been tested positive. And this has really caused some problems. On July 4th, a bunch of Americans were walking around Busan, had this big party, no face coverings, no masks, no social distancing. And this kind of stuff has really angered people in Korea as well as in Japan. Even the Japanese government's a little bit ticked off. But it really shows the utter arrogance of the American military toward the supposed allies of the U.S. In terms of the peace process, I would say it's kind of hanging by a thread, but it's kind of a strong thread, really, because no matter what the North Korean side says in terms of they don't want to deal with Trump anymore and they don't want to talk anymore of useless negotiations, they're not setting off ICBMs or testing ICBMs or testing more sophisticated weapons. They're sticking to their freeze on these strategic weapons, and so they haven't pulled out of any kind of talks. They've been very critical, saying that basically Trump is using this to build his own political reputation and to win the election, but they're not pulling out. So that's all good. In terms of North and South, if anyone's been following what's been going on there the last month, it's been about sometime in June, after some warnings from the North Korean leadership, including Kim Jong-un's sister, Kim Yo-jong, who's become quite powerful in the Korean leadership. They were warning about one, that they were saying that Moon is just way too dependent on the U.S. and has not been able to move the U.S. off its position of lifting any kind of sanctions. And so they, that's the North side has been angry about that, but they've also been angry about the inability, what they claim is the inability of the South Korean government to crack down on these defectors that send balloons filled with propaganda across the border into North Korea. And I've been doing a little bit of reporting on this for News Top, this investigative company in the investigative website in South Korea. And a lot of these defector groups are funded by people in Washington. There's several organizations here in Washington that provide a lot of their money, including the National Endowment for Democracy, which is part of the US government. And they fund some of the key defector groups that are doing this. So it's not entirely a problem in South Korea. It's a problem made in the USA as well. And I think that's contributing to the problem in terms of continuing the peace process there. And so that's the, but like, at one point after the North Korean side blew up these buildings in Kaesong, the liaison offices between North and South, and Kim Yo-jong made some very strong statements about the South. A couple days later, Kim Jong-un came on and made some statements basically trying to cool down the situation. So, there appears to be some differences of opinion, perhaps within the North Korean leadership, about how to deal with both the US and the South. But clearly, the leadership there, wants to press on and have some kind of, peace deal. And so that's all pretty important. The third thing is that, Christine will talk about this, and I actually just finished writing an article for The Nation about the forum that happened on Monday about the peace treaty idea that was sponsored by Quincy and the American Conservative, and of course, Women Cross DMC. And it's, Christine will talk about the peace treaty part, but it's very important to note that on Monday, the same day that forum was held in Seoul, 324 South Korean civic groups issued a call for a peace treaty, and they said we're going to try to get 100 million signatures to around the world to call on the U.S. to sign a peace treaty to end the Korean War. And the fact that you have South Korean citizens doing this, citizens groups doing it at the same time it's happening in the U.S. is really a very, very good sign, a very powerful sign, I think. That you know, something is changing in terms of our politics, and I think there's openings here, you know, for a change in that kind of policy. And then I just want to mention that everyone who wants to learn about what happened in terms of the breakdown of the U.S. talks with North Korea should read at least try to get the free version of John Bolton's book that's been floating around the internet. That's how I read it. But John Bolton's is just unbelievable, the way the contempt he showed in his book for South Korea and President Moon Jae-in. And he just dismisses the whole idea of engagement and the sunshine policy toward North Korea, the relaxation of tension. He just sees that as just a big hoax, basically, like Trump sees everything. And it really made people in South Korea very angry. In fact, you know, the government and you know, President Moon's Blue House put out a blistering statement about John Bolton's book, you know, which was quite unusual for them to do this. But I mean, it was, what he said was so infuriating, and it obviously colored a lot of the officials that were working with Trump and Bolton on these talks. I'm sure Pompeo has the same, Secretary of State Pompeo has the same attitude toward South Korea. They could give a rat's ass about, you know, engage, you know, lowering tensions there, and they you know, Trump clearly wants a deal for himself, but they don't really care about the Korean struggle for peace and ending the war and wanting to have reconciliation. And I think that finally, you know, if Joe Biden wins the presidency, you know, is there going to be a change in U.S. policy? I'm not really sure. I mean, I've seen articles, including in The Nation, where I write about Biden's, you know, foreign policy people, his team so far, and they're very, you know, it's a lot of it's the same people that were with Obama, and it's a bunch of hawks, and it's a bunch of neocons, and a lot of them are, you know, part of the military-industrial complex. You know, they play key roles in the military-industrial complex, you know, working for defense contractors, funding defense contractors, working for private equity funds that are involved in funding the intelligence and defense companies, and you know, a lot of that's where Biden's people come from, and he has said, you know, that he might meet with Kim Jong-un, but he always uses the word thug when he talks about Kim, which is not a very good way to try to get negotiations going if you're going to do it. And the Democratic Party policy, you know, the policy they're putting out for the presidential election platform is pretty hawkish, and it's all about, you know, this maintaining the same kind of military structure that the U.S. has had there for years. That's part of the problem. The other day at the seminar, I was very impressed by Jessica Lee, who was talking from Quincy, you know, who was talking about the main opponent of a peace agreement in the U.S. is the military-industrial complex. You know, because keeping the war going, keeping tensions high is great for companies like Raytheon and Lockheed Martin and you know, all these other defense and military contractors. So you know, they don't want to have peace because, you know, their whole strategy is based on, you know, maintaining this massive military structure in East Asia that's now being more and more aimed at restraining China and you know, aggressively restraining China. And so, you know, I think there's some, it's very difficult to say, but I think that the pressure through, you know, Women Cross DMZ and Quincy and other people like that, and people that are talking to the Democrats about having a better kind of platform, better foreign policy, you know, could make a difference. And the last thing I'll say is that, you know, Biden has said he would work with allies. And if he wants, you know, he's got a great ally in President Moon Jae-in, who's, you know, really been, you know, wanting to have an agreement, very patiently working with the US, very patiently working with North Korea. That is a situation that hopefully his advisors will say, let's take advantage of this and try to get some kind of agreement. That is, if he wins. But I think that situation now, unless the US makes a fundamental change toward its approach to North Korea and does something like, cross recognition, diplomatic recognition, liaison offices in North Korea and in Washington for the North Koreans, unless there's some fundamental shift, I don't think much is going to happen. And unfortunately, that plays a big role in what happens between North and South. So I think we're still in a situation where the pressure from citizen groups is very, very important. And I'll close right there.
Well, thank you very much, Tim. Lots of food for thought, and certainly we're hoping for changes in so much of our national security network with the election coming up. But if indeed Biden is elected, then putting that pressure on him is really, really important to move on to try to find a way through to a peace accord at least. Next we have, as our panelist, Christine Ahn. Christine is the founder and executive director of Women Across the DMZ, a global movement of women mobilizing to end the Korean War, reunite families, and ensure women's leadership in peace building. In 2015, she led 30 international women peacemakers from 15 countries, and I was one of them. Thank you, Christine, for organizing that. Across the demilitarized zone. Yeah, and Tim was there on the other side of it to greet us. Taking women peacemakers from 15 countries across the DMZ from North Korea to South Korea. We walked with 10,000 Korean women on both sides of the DMZ and held women's peace symposia in Pyongyang and Seoul, where we discussed the impact of the unresolved war on women's lives. In March of 2019, Women Across the DMZ launched a global campaign, the Korea Peace Now, women mobilizing to end the war, with a coalition of women's organizations, which Christine will tell us about here. She's the co-founder of the Korea Peace Network, Korea Policy Institute, global campaign to save Jeju Island, yay, North Koreans for Fair Trade, and the national campaign to end the Korean War. She's organized peace and humanitarian aid delegations, of course, to North and South Korea, and she's addressed the US Congress, the Canadian Parliament, the Republic of Korea National Commission on Human Rights, and the National Assembly. She has written prolifically in the New York Times, San Francisco Chronicle, Washington Post, and has appeared on many TV shows, including, of course, Democracy Now!, but also on the Today Show, NPR, MSNBC, Voice of America. Christine, thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much, Anne, and it's so great to be with all of you and with Vets for Peace, who've just been such staunch allies in this work. So thank you so much for having all of us. I'm just gonna quickly share PowerPoint because I just think that our movement is so visually beautiful. So can you guys see that?
Yep.
Okay, great. So as Anne mentioned, we organized this peace walk in 2015 on the 70th anniversary of Korea's division by Cold War powers, the United States and the former Soviet Union. And so that's, let's see, somehow my thing, okay, here we go. So we did this on that 70th anniversary of Korea's division. And just really quickly, we started our journey in Beijing. This is the women peacemakers. You see some pretty prominent women, the Nobel Peace Laureates, Gloria Steinem, our very own Anne Wright. And then we held women's peace symposiums in Pyongyang. And this is a beautiful image of a quilt stitching ceremony that Anne should tell the story about connecting with the 5-star general from North Korea. And then we did a peace walk We did one with 5,000 North Korean women on the streets of Pyongyang on the road to the DMZ, and then with 2,000 North Korean women in Kaesong. And then we crossed the DMZ. We wanted to walk, but they bussed us, of course. And this is us walking for quite a bit along the barbed wire fences in Paju on the southern side of the DMZ. And we held a women's peace symposium at the Seoul City Hall, which was actually very controversial at the time. So we have been really pushing for women's inclusion in peace processes, because we know that when women are involved in peace processes, it actually leads to an agreement. And if women are involved in the drafting of that agreement, it's 35% more likely to last 15 years or longer. And there's now actually 10 Security Council resolutions. And this is the set, about women and peace and security. And this is the 20th anniversary of UN Security Council Resolution 1325 about mandating women's inclusion in all levels of the peace process. And even the US, President Trump probably unknowingly signed this Women, Peace and Security Act of 2017, but it was, pretty bipartisan and broad in its support. So now we say it's time to take these agreements off paper and put them into action. So on that note, in 2019, 4 women's organizations, Women Across DMZ, the Nobel Women's Initiative, Korean Women's Movement for Peace, a coalition of South Korean women's groups, and WILF organized and launched this campaign, Korea Peace Now. And our goals are, we want to see a formal end to the Korean War. We want to see a peace process. We want to see women's inclusion at all levels, both at the government, both at the civil society level. We want to see tangible demilitarization, including the reduction of US troops and denuclearization. We want to see the lifting of sanctions against North Korea. And we want to see a national conversation shifting from focus on militarization to addressing real human and ecological, sustainability. So it seems like the pandemic is providing quite a golden opportunity for us to push that new framework. And so we launched this campaign. We did it in DC, we did it in New York at the UN, in Ottawa, Canada, in Seoul, South Korea. And we brought a delegation of South Korean parliamentarians to actually meet with US Congresswomen. And, some of those relationships keep flourishing. So for example, one of the South Korean parliamentarians sat in a breakfast roundtable with Barbara Lee. And they both sat across the table from each other and both realized that both of their fathers had fought and served in the Korean War, and what it meant for them now to be in these positions as lawmakers to help bring a formal closure to that war. And so we've been, making trouble, trying to get our messaging as far and wide as possible and on TV. We really believe that it's so important. And then we've been meeting with senior officials. So we have, Dan is in the picture on the left, and I know Anne went to go meet Matthew Pottinger, who was the National Security Council Advisor for Asia, Stephen Beacon, who's now the Deputy Secretary of State, Moon Chung-in, who is the senior envoy on North Korea. And last December, I went to Cambodia to meet Mr. Oh Ryong-il, who is the head of the National Peace Committee. Liz Bernstein and I did that because Americans are banned from traveling to North Korea. And we believe it's so important to bring women together. So we, have led delegations to South Korea to support the peace process. We've tried to bring North and South Korean women together. We finally succeeded at a Beijing roundtable in December 2018, where we brought women from North Korea, South Korea, China, Russia, Japan, and the United States to talk about how women will end the war. And so one exciting thing that we've been doing is pushing for House Resolution 152, which was introduced by Ro Khanna. It now has 46 co-sponsors, which is an extraordinary feat. Let me tell you, as somebody who has been hitting the pavement and the halls of Congress, I've seen how there has been such resistance for any peace with North Korea, much less calling for a peace agreement to end the war. So this is really the result of grassroots organizing and power. I can't even tell you enough. And so part of this Korea Peace Now campaign has yielded several regional chapters. We now have 11 across the country. They're a mixture of Korean Americans, multi-generation faith groups, groups working on humanitarian aid. It's really a beautiful grassroots movement that is flourishing. And so last year, we would have done this year were it not for the pandemic. We had big actions all across the country around the day of the Armistice Agreement. One other important thing that we did, which YOON is one of the co-authors of, is released a report on the human and gender impact of sanctions on North Korea. And that has really, I think, opened the conversation on the impact of sanctions on ordinary people. It was first covered by the Wall Street Journal. And I think it's an important contribution that sanctions have been a key obstacle in the peace process between the US and North Korea. And we have to show that they are not working and achieving the aim of denuclearization, and they are not, and they are harming the most innocent people in North Korea. I'm gonna quickly wrap up, but I think one thing that's been really amazing on this journey, in 2015, as we were crossing the DMZ, a key argument made by detractors of ours, you know, they called us handmaidens, they used all sorts of things. It was very gendered, I would say. You know, we were apologists for North Korea, and they said we didn't care about the human rights of North Korean people. And I think it's just an extraordinary shift in perspective, where you now have the UN Special Rapporteur on North Korea human rights release a report at the Human Rights Council where he says that actually peace is beneficial to human rights and that there should be a peace declaration regardless of denuclearization. And in his report, I had to pull this up, he says, you know, he's been meeting with women across DMZ, and you should see the last line: governments should hear the message from this movement. So I feel very redemptive about, and so I'm just gonna quickly wrap up. Tim kind of mentioned some of this, but I think for me, as somebody that is so steeped in this movement, it's been extraordinary to see that actually, I think an architecture has been built where transnational peace movements are really coming together to kind of weave this really tight bond to really push for an end to the Korean War. And so just really quickly, Tim mentioned the 324 civil society groups that launched this campaign for 1 million signatures. They want to see a peace treaty by 2023. And, you know, we held this transpartisan roundtable where we brought the Quincy Institute, the American Conservative, and brought, you know, experts from across the political spectrum, all kind of having consensus about the need for a peace agreement, need for peace to end the Korean War. Danny Davis was one of the experts. He's a Lieutenant Army Colonel who served in Korea. And he basically said, this is a waste of US tax dollars, and this is just keeping war on the table. We need a peace agreement to change the relationship with North Korea, and the US should take the lead as the more powerful country. Dan can maybe talk about this more, but the Korea Peace Network, the Korea Peace Now campaign, and another peace treaty network, 3 major grassroots networks, are now really in serious discussions to figure out how to coordinate better. So that is really exciting. And then just the last few points I want to make is that South Korea, Moon Jae-in, the president, appointed the first ambassador of gender equality, whose mandate includes women, peace, and security. I bring this up because in the research that I've been doing about women's involvement, inclusion, and peace processes, there's a very important nexus that takes place. If you look at other peace processes, whether it's in Colombia or in the Philippines, where women peace builders, the civil society activists, are having some kind of I don't know, liaising with women negotiators. And I think it's so fascinating that North Korea, you have two major women that are involved in the peace process. You have Kim Yo-jong, and you have Kim Jong-un's sister, and you also have Madam Choi Son-hee, who is the foreign minister who has been interfacing with the Americans. And then in South Korea, you have Ambassador Kang Kyung-hwa, and now you have this ambassador of gender equality who has a direct line with the South Korean women's peace movements. Our biggest obstacle is obviously the United States. In the Trump administration, there is one woman, Allison Hooker, who is from NSC, is not accessible to civil society at all. But who knows with the next administration? But I think that's a very important point to make, is that we are going to keep pushing, and we hope that some kind of nexus will be made, because it has yielded a peace agreement in those various countries, but also gender protections for women in those peace agreements. And then last 2 points. One is about the 46th co-sponsor. This is fascinating. Brad Sherman, who is from the LA area, he's on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. He's a very mainstream Democrat. And for him to have had his positions on North Korea have been very reactionary. It's been very Cold War, like most of the Democratic Party. And he recently co-sponsored House Resolution 152. I think that signals a major shift in what we hope if there is a Biden administration. And then lastly, we are in a historic moment in this country. This is the first time Bernie Sanders and Senator Markey's resolution or amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act to cut Pentagon spending by 10%. We are in a moment. And the fact that the Korean War is the longest standing US military conflict, overseas conflict, the fact that it inaugurated the military industrial complex, I think that by ending the Korean War will make a huge contribution in kind of reeling back and reversing that the Pentagon out of control spending. And I think the moment that we're in right now calls for defund the police, defund the military, invest in things that give us true security, is a historic and golden opportunity. So in my view, I think the stars are aligning, and it has been the result of grassroots and civil society power. We have to just keep pushing it, because the people will lead and then the leaders will follow. So thank you for letting me share my perspective.
Well, thank you very much, Christine. That's a very hopeful message based on a lot of hard work over the last 5 years in particular. It's been quite a struggle to get the funding, to have these wonderful organizations have now the capability to really do a lot of organizing, which has really gone well. And thanks to Women Across the DMZ for all your leadership in that. And another leader that has been working hard on grassroots is Dan JASPER. He's with the American Friends Service Committee. He's the public education and advocacy coordinator for Asia. But most of it, well, I shouldn't say most of it, but a lot of his work is on humanitarian, peace building, people-to-people aspects of the US and North Korea relations. Dan has 10 years of experience in working in public policy, advocacy, and international affairs. Prior to joining AFSC, he worked at the World Learning, where he administered the US State Department's International Visitors Leadership Program. He also worked for the Minnesota House of Representatives and then the US House of Representatives and at the UN. He also was a Peace Corps volunteer in Turkmenistan and in St. Lucia, where he collaborated with foreign ministries to help improve local education standards. He has a master's degree in public policy from Duke University and a bachelor's in global studies and cultural studies and linguistics from the University of Minnesota. He is the author of AFSC's very important book called Engaging North Korea. He's also been a writer that has had articles in New York Times and Washington Post and many other venues. So Dan, we thank you very much for your leadership and all these things that pertain to North Korea. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you so much for that way generous introduction here. And I'm going to share my screen in a minute, but I want to quickly pick up where Christine left off and offer some words of gratitude for Vets for Peace. As a reminder, Vets for Peace was one of the founding organizations of the Korea Peace Network. And we started out, I think, with just 6 members 5 years ago. And Christine mentioned that Representative Brad Sherman recently signed on to HRES 152. And it is really significant because when we started with just 6 organizations lobbying Congress, Brad Sherman was, he was like here on the peace-o-meter, if you will. And, over the years, he's just sort of kind of gradually waned, and started to move. And it was really incredible to see that, I think, over the last couple of years. And he's a good barometer of that. But I think I've seen that in a number of offices. So, a huge thank you for Vets for Peace for being such a stalwart partner in all this stuff. So I'm going to try to share my screen. Had mixed luck today. Okay, can you all see that? Okay.
Yes, we can.
Great. Wonderful. Okay, so, oh, it looks a little messed up here, but I think that's okay. I'm going to give a little bit of background, and I'm going to focus my comments specifically on the American Friends Service Committee and sort of our experience in North Korea. And I'm going to do so because we have a little bit of a unique perspective in some of this. We do have an agricultural assistance project in North Korea, but we have a very long history working on Korea in general. For those of you who aren't familiar with the American Friends Service Committee, it's a Quaker organization. It was started in World War I, and it was a way for Quakers to serve their communities without using violence. And after World War I, the organization continued and started all sorts of programs throughout the United States, but also throughout the world. And when, I think in 1953, pretty much as soon as the armistice was signed, there was a call by the United Nations for organizations to provide relief efforts. And AFSC was one of the first organizations in the door in South Korea, providing some relief and reconstruction aid. And you can see here on the way left over here, there's a picture, a black and white picture. I believe her name is Patty Hunt. She was one of the first AFSC volunteers in Korea. And I think I love this image so much because you can see that she's given the Korean women an apron, not food, right? So there was very much a capacity building element, and there was very much what Quakers like to call accompaniment, and not so much, we're here to save you type attitude. And that's something that we really try to keep in the forefront of our minds as we do this work. With regards to South Korea, though, that work came and went pretty quickly. We were only there for about 5 years because the UN only asked for 5 years of help. And so when they no longer really needed our assistance, we left, but we stayed engaged in the region, and we stayed engaged mainly in Japan, helping with some reconstruction efforts there. But staff members were intensely, or I should say acutely aware of the fact that Korea was never really settled, and that the United States really had a huge part in all of that. And so staff members tried persistently, I think for a number of years, almost a decade, I want to say, throughout the 70s, to try to enter the North, DPRK, in order to just build a little bit of understanding and to start to build some bridges between US civil society and North Koreans. And they were finally allowed to enter in 1980. And so that made AFSC actually the first US NGO to enter North Korea. And it really kicked off a really amazing partnership. And throughout the 80s and early 90s, AFSC had what was basically an exchange program. We would send staff over there, and then we would bring North Koreans to the United States. And you can see this middle picture here of North Koreans standing in front of the Liberty Bell, which I believe, I just think this is such an awesome picture. And it's used to be kind of commonplace for these exchanges to carry on. But I would say around 2015 or so, exchanges with North Koreans pretty much stopped. And that was before the travel ban. So it was sort of a slow death to exchanges, and it's pretty sad. But in the middle of the 90s, that exchange program allowed us to have such a partnership and a lot of trust with the organizations that we interface on the ground there, that the North Koreans actually opened up to staff, and they revealed that there was a situation in the country which our staff later understood to be a famine. And they were one of the first international observers to see famine conditions in the country. And they were completely shocked, not only by the conditions that they saw during the famine, but also by the fact that the partners showed them this. They thought that was such a sort of a vulnerable moment. And they saw that as such a barometer for trust that they really wanted to sort of latch onto this program and make sure it didn't die. And so, you know, after, of course, they saw that they started gathering funds for aid efforts. But that program spun off into something more sustainable after the famine subsided. You know, our staff and our partners identified that food security was a huge part of this conflict that really didn't quite get the same level of attention as some of the other aspects of the conflict. And so we decided together that we would start an agricultural assistance project. And this is the project that we have today. And you can see that there's a picture here of us standing in the rice fields up in the upper right here. And I always tell people this is the most dangerous part of us going to North Korea, is when we go out into the rice fields and we have to stand on these mud brick or mud walls. Every once in a while, somebody will fall in. But you know, the way that we operate now is we work with 4 cooperative farms, which feed about 12,000 people in all. And we also have several pilot projects that extend our aid to about 72,000 more families. So it's 84,000 people altogether that our programs impact, and our budget is very minuscule. We don't really have a ton of resources to put towards this, but we've worked so effectively with our partners because we listen to them and we trust that they know what they need. And that's kind of where we're at today. Here we are. So I want to, quickly walk through what we've experienced. And it's, it goes without saying, I think, that working in North Korea has never been easy. And, prior to the Trump administration, things were getting gradually worse. But with the Trump administration coming into power, it was a quick descent, I think, into much worse than we thought. And, this is just a quick sliver. I wanted to give you a timeline because what's been disturbing to me is that there's been a new narrative with COVID developing here in Washington. Tim mentions some of the developments that happened early on in COVID. So I think, North Korea was probably one of the first countries to close its borders, and they did so in January. And so they've been closed. They've let a little bit of aid in here and there, but not much. And they won't allow visitors in, and most shipments are being sort of postponed for the time being. Since COVID started, I've noticed that some experts in Washington have started to sort of shift the blame of humanitarian, I would say, humanitarian obstructions to North Korea. And they say, well, they won't let aid in because of COVID. But this isn't quite the full picture. And in fact, it's quite frustrating to hear this narrative because it's I think, misleading, if not totally false. And so I wanted to give just a sort of a sliver of the timeline that we've seen to one, give you a picture of what's really happening with the aid right now and how this has played out in the last couple of years, and also to give you a sense of what's been going on behind the scenes in terms of the diplomacy. Because there's no doubt in my mind that this stuff really impacts the larger environment for diplomacy. It's no secret that humanitarian organizations are used as sort of telegraphing instruments between the North and the US about, if they're going to give more organizations permissions to do activities, then, that means they're sort of letting up and letting the environment more conducive to talks. If they start to close things down, it's the opposite, of course. So going back just before the Singapore summit, the Trump administration had begun to tighten things pretty badly. For instance, things that used to take AFSC a couple of hours to do began to take months to do. We had, our shipments are basically very lightweight. We send things like plastic rice trays, sheeting for greenhouses, that kind of stuff. and nothing that's really that would break sanctions. Nonetheless, there were a few regulations that were put into place that required extensive processes to get permissions to send this stuff. And so, like I said, you know, things that used to take us a few hours to do, to contact traders and suppliers and so on, used to take hours, began to take 9 months or more. And, you know, to get a permission to send one aid shipment can take anywhere from 9 months to, I've heard some aid groups say, takes 3 years to get this. And when you're dealing with humanitarian aid, you really can't, you don't have this time to spare. Most of this stuff is timed. For instance, AFSC's shipments are timed to the agricultural seasons. So we time it to the planting season and we time it to the harvesting season. You know, there's groups that do medical aid and they time it to restock medical equipment and things like that. And there's not really a whole lot of wiggle room when you're dealing with this stuff. But that was not really a consideration, I don't think, for the Trump administration. And it was something that we complained about very quickly. And they put another regulations in place that Christine already mentioned, which was travel restrictions. And these were, you know, anyone with a US passport or any US passport holders could not travel to North Korea, except for a few exceptions. And you have to apply to get what's called a special validation passport to get that. And so there are exceptions for humanitarian workers, journalists, Red Cross workers, and then anybody that the State Department deems as carrying a national security interest. So these regulations were put into place before Singapore, and we were already dealing with that. But to zoom in on this little timeline that I made here, we had the Singapore summit in June of 2018, and it obviously looked like a moment in which it could reset relations. And so we were obviously very excited about this. And AFSC, I don't know about other organizations, but we started to think up and start to think through how we could scale up our programs, what we might do in a new environment and things like that. But not much after the Singapore summit, I mean, weeks after it, we started to realize within the humanitarian community, which isn't very big, that people were being denied permissions for travel. People were being denied permissions to send aid, and it was very ad hoc. You know, we kind of had to piece this stuff together. And then it didn't take long for us to basically put it together that everybody was being denied. And we kept confronting the State Department about this. And at one point, we finally got them on the record that said, yes, this is US policy that we are now denying the ability for aid workers to travel to North Korea. And that was big. That was a bombshell for us. But it also gave us a lot of ammunition, because now we could take that and go to Congress and say, you know, they're sort of breaking what had been a bipartisan consensus for decades that we should be able to carry out humanitarian work there. And on top of that, they had done it just after they signed a public agreement to improve relations. So it didn't make any sense. You know, in the public realm, they were saying that we signed the Singapore agreement and that we were improving relations, but behind the scenes, they were actually rolling back things, and they were actually cutting off channels that had been in place for decades. In some cases, in the case of AFSC, for 4 decades. And so it was clearly sending the wrong signals to the North Koreans, and it was impacting parts of the negotiation that we had to piece together for the State Department. We said, well, you know why they're sort of stalling on some of this stuff, right? It's because you're telegraphing to them that you're not really sincere about some of these agreements that you're making. They didn't really buy that. And in fact, they went on a full, I would say, almost offensive, to claim, or to, I would say, build an argument that humanitarian groups were not putting into place any, adequate monitoring and evaluation procedures. And this was something that was really startling to me. AFSC has a really good relationship with the State Department, and we have for a long time. And we have never, we've had conversations around monitoring and evaluation, but before this had been put into place, nobody had asked us, what are your procedures, what's gone right and what's gone wrong. It felt very much like a retroactive justification for what they had put into place. And so just to clarify, they were saying, well, we're not going to let aid groups travel to North Korea because we're worried about their monitoring and evaluation procedures. Now, that doesn't make much sense. If you're worried about our monitoring and evaluation, we need to go there in order to make sure that our aid is getting to where it needs to go. And that's probably, one of the biggest aspects of our M&E program is to go and get eyes on the ground. So it didn't really add up. And, and once we got them on the record, we really hit the pavement. And, some of the humanitarian groups, AFSC, the Mennonite Central Committee, and then of course the Korea Peace Network, including Vets for Peace, really hit the pavement. And we knocked on everybody's door in Congress. We talked to anybody who would listen, and we really made a stink about this. And it made a huge difference. This was grassroots pressure, and we actually had a State Department official tell us point blank. He said, "You know what? You guys are David. We are Goliath. Every once in a while, you'll grab a stone, and sometimes you'll make contact." And this was one of those points. But you'll see that from this image here in the winter of 2018, when the Foreign Policy ran this article that said the U.S. to ease limits on humanitarian aid to North Korea. For one, the image makes it look like the U.S. and North Korea came to an agreement to roll back or to ease limits. And the article puts it in really framing almost in terms like the administration had done so graciously, sort of, as benevolence, almost as an act of benevolence. Which was really confusing to us because, in fact, that wasn't really the case. They had done so because there was immense congressional pressure, which had come from grassroots pressure in turn. So it was really quite a remarkable moment. And I don't think the narrative of humanitarian aid is really, I don't think it's really clarified in Washington, D.C. about this timeline. And you'll see that in the spring of 2019, the headline here is the humanitarian groups say sanctions impede aid to North Koreans. So it looks like nothing's really changed. And I mean, in some ways that's kind of true, but I think what's happened is that the administration has opened up the aperture just enough to let humanitarian groups travel there, to let a little bit of aid get in so that there's not much of a stink and we can't really get Congress on our side to push further. But the fact remains that it's incredibly difficult for us to get aid to North Korea. It's still very difficult for us to travel there. In fact, just last year, we had applied for our special validation passports for 2 Americans on our delegation. I received my passport 2 weeks before we were supposed to go, no problem. But my colleague received her passport 1 day before we were supposed to enter the country. And so obviously you can't plan a humanitarian delegation like that. And so it scuttled the whole thing. And as a consequence, we haven't been back there since 2018, which is a huge problem. And in fact, we keep telling them that their own policies are getting in their way. If they're very concerned about monitoring and evaluation, they really need to reconsider some of this stuff. I had, moving ahead here. So I had inserted a interim slide here, but it looks like it's missing now. But I'll just quickly mention that, throughout this entire period, what's now public is the fact that the American Friends Service Committee was being investigated by the Treasury Department for its operations in North Korea. This was completely startling to us. We had, as Ann mentioned, we had written several pamphlets outlining our programs very extensively, and we were putting it in the hands of White House officials, State Department officials, members of Congress, the Treasury Department themselves, pretty much anybody that we would talk to. And not only were we saying this is what we're doing, and we were saying this is what the U.S. government should be doing. And so we were advocating to scale up our programs. And so when we had found out that we had been under investigation, we were completely baffled. We were so transparent in our minds. We had been not only just transparent, what you would expect from humanitarian organizations, but we had actually been advocating for our programs, which most humanitarian organizations are very hesitant to do, given the environments that they work in. The investigation has since been settled in a relatively amicable way, I guess. We weren't penalized for it or anything like that. But the whole thing was very startling, and it sent shockwaves to humanitarian groups for the fact that the Treasury Department was using resources to go after pittance for sending essentially plastic sheeting for greenhouses to North Korea for humanitarian programs. So this goes to show you about where sort of sanctions enforcement is sometimes. It doesn't seem to be where the popular narrative really is. I want to quickly also mention 3 other programs that AFSC really supports and tries to advocate for there in the humanitarian sphere. And I think a lot of you all will appreciate this. The first is, some of you all will be familiar with the issue of divided families, and Christine talked a little bit about this as well. This is one of the reasons that our staff members cited for going into North Korea in the first place, to try to build bridges for not only the divided North and South Koreans, but also for the Korean Americans who remain divided as well. And this is something that just seems like a no-brainer. If you're trying to build trust and to sort of heal the wounds of war, this is the first place you have to start. Some of these families have been separated for 70 years. And to institute a reunion program really wouldn't cost all that much. And it really wouldn't, I wouldn't say it would give up any leverage or anything. It would basically start to create an environment conducive to higher level diplomacy. And you'd allow State Department officials to interface with North Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs officials, which basically never happens. And so there's a huge disconnect in terms of how the cultures work. And I've noticed that sometimes with our State Department officials, there's just some nuance there that they don't understand in terms of how North Koreans operate. So programs like that would be a great way to sort of improve that capacity. The middle one here is probably something you all appreciate and probably are aware of. Currently, there are still 7,000 remains of US soldiers left in North Korea from the Korean War. In the past, there's been repatriation programs between the Department of Defense and the North Korean military. This is a wonderful program. It's been successful, and I don't remember. I want to say there's about 200 boxes that have been brought home in all, but I think it's probably more than that. Recently, y'all probably will remember in the spring of 2018, there were 55 boxes that were returned to the United States from North Korea. I've heard numerous officials from both the United States and from North Korea say that that was the most successful cooperation during this most recent detente between the US and North Korea. And so why wouldn't we continue with this program? It just doesn't make much sense to me. And I think this is probably some of the first things that people should look for in order to build trust. This sort of like grand bargain approach has obviously not quite worked, and some of these things have been sort of overlooked. I also want to quickly mention the International Visitor Leadership Program. This is just one of many exchange programs that the United States has at the ready that are capable of doing a lot of great things. And IVLP in particular is a program that the State Department uses for, I would say, hostile or enemy countries and even isolated states. I administrated this program, as Ann mentioned in the introduction, for Iranians in the lead up to the Iran agreement, JCPOA. And in fact, actually this tapestry behind me was a gift from a delegation of theirs. And so we know it's possible to do this stuff. And when we started to advocate for this idea, we realized that this program, the International Visitor Leadership Program, has taken place with every single country in the world except North Korea. And it's been in place with countries that we want to make a detente. This is pretty much a protocol of State Department for diplomacy. If there's we want to transform, this is usually one of the first things that the State Department does. But when we started to advocate for it, we were told that it would basically be impossible to bring North Koreans for this program. And so we actually had to do a feasibility study to prove them wrong. Today, they know that's very possible, but are still reluctant to do it for, I can't tell any good reason. But I just want to mention those 3 things because there's a whole suite of options that are out there that we might call low-hanging fruit that have been completely dismissed by a lot of the policy wonks here in DC. And it's really quite heartbreaking because, as you see from this upper left-hand corner, it has very real consequences. And as you all know from being veterans, there are a lot of families that are still waiting to hear back from where their loved ones are in the Korean War. Every once in a while, I want to say about every 4 weeks, there's a story of remains being identified from the Korean War that were sent back in past negotiations. And it's the stories that come out of that are just really incredible. I mean, bringing whole towns together. There was one story recently that there was a family that had not spoken in decades because they had some family issue. And when the remains of their uncle came home from the Korean War, they all came together, and actually it actually brought the whole family together, and they began sort of speaking again. And it was quite remarkable to read. I'll just quickly mention some of the policy recommendations that we have right now. With regard to improving the humanitarian assistance, I think one of the most important pieces of legislation out there currently is the Enhancing North Korea Humanitarian Assistance Act. This bill was recently introduced in both the House and the Senate. We are very grateful to see this, and a lot of people worked very hard on this for many years. And so we are really, really grateful for Vets for Peace for helping out with and past advocacy programs to get this bill up and running. In short, what this bill would do would basically ease the permissions for sending humanitarian shipments and ease permissions for us to travel there. I'll also mention the Senate Bill 3395, the Korean War Divided Families Reunification Act, which would allow the State Department, or which would mandate the State Department to brief divided families on the state of negotiations where they are right now. This is something the Department of Defense does for families of veterans. They brief them on the state of negotiations in terms of repatriation of remains. So I don't see why the State Department couldn't do that for divided families. And then, of course, Christine already mentioned HRES 152. So again, thank you so much. These are some quick scenes from North Korea that I really love to share. And, you know, they're just very humanizing. And we have a wedding over here. And I had been walking through a park, and this old lady, they were dancing, and this old lady basically literally grabbed me and started dancing with me. And it was just such a random and unbelievable moment of connection that I love to share. And I love this picture over here on the right where one of our partners is on his phone, and we were sitting on the metro, and this kid from school was kind of looking over his shoulder. And it just goes to show you, I think, that North Koreans are much more connected than I think we often realize. So thanks again, and I will stop there.
Well, thank you very much, Dan. We really appreciate all that information. And you mentioned the Vets for Peace and the Korea Peace Campaign that we have, which has been led by John Kim for so very long. So we thank him for all of the work that he's done with all of the various organizations. And as you ended your presentation with pictures of North Korea, our final panelist knows more about North Korea than any of us, because she and her family have lived in North Korea for 10 years. Joy Yoon and her family, her husband, a medical doctor, and her 5 kids are part of just a very few number of American families that have ever lived inside North Korea. They've lived and worked there for 10 years. She herself, well, her husband is a medical doctor, but she herself has a certification in special education and educational therapy. And she's been able to blend these science and medical things with education to help people or children in North Korea with developmental disabilities. She initiated the very first educational therapy program for children with cerebral palsy, autism, and learning disabilities in North Korea through the nonprofit that she and her husband work with, the Ignis community. And they were asked by the government of North Korea to create the Pyongyang Spine Rehabilitation Center, the first specialty center of its kind that trains doctors in a graduate program while treating children with developmental disabilities. Joy has written a wonderful book called Discovering Joy, 10 Years in North Korea. It came out in 2018. And I happened to read it the night before I met her, which was in Dallas, Texas last year, or maybe just the year before, through a combination of the South Korean women parliamentarians coming to Washington and many of us going with them to meet various representatives. And I went with the group that went to meet Bernice Johnson, Congresswoman from Texas, from Dallas, who then got in touch with us to say she has a peace symposium every year in Dallas. And I was honored to be able to go to that. And here I met Joy Yoon, who had lived in North Korea for 10 years. And we are so thrilled, Joy, that you have written your book that tells so much. I know it's been a challenge with your family being back in the US for a while, and now you're in South Korea. So we have somebody from South Korea right here on our presentation. And we're really thrilled and look forward to your information about what is going on in North Korea and your work there, please.
Well, thank you so much, Anne, for that generous introduction. And it is such an honor for me to be able to share with Veterans for Peace. I am so respectful of all the work that they do, and each one of your organizations have done. Women Across the DMZ and Dan JASPER's been very instrumental in protecting humanitarian work in North Korea. So there's just so much I can say about each one of you. So it's a privilege for me to be here with you today. Let me see if I can share my presentation, and we'll get started. Are you seeing anything?
Yes, we are. Mm-hmm.
Great.
Yes.
I think for me, I am not in the political scene. I'm a humble humanitarian worker, and I've been living in North Korea for over 10 years. Unfortunately, as you have already heard, I've had to leave North Korea, both our family and about 200 US citizens had to leave North Korea as a result of the US travel restriction, travel ban that came out on September 1st of 2017. So since then, we have been in the same boat as everyone else, having to apply for special validation passports to be able to continue our humanitarian work in North Korea. But what I really want to do today is give a human face to the people of North Korea. I think what happens is a lot of times we dehumanize North Korea, and we dehumanize people all around the world based on our political preferences, based on our political objectives. And so it's important for us to remember that people are people everywhere, and North Koreans are just like you and me. Our organization that my husband and I co-founded, known as Ignis Community, is actually an international organization, although we're quite small. We have a group, these are just the field workers ourselves, those who live on the border and inside North Korea, typically, but it's an international group from all over the world, many people in different parts of Asia, such as China, South Koreans working along the border with us, the Filipinos, Mongolians, people from Singapore, and now we have a medical professional from Brazil also on our team working with us in Pyongyang. So just to give you an idea that it's not just the United States, even though we are based in the United States, we also have people all around the world working with us through our small organization. We began working in North Korea through medical work. As Anne shared, my husband is a rehabilitation doctor. And so doors started to open for us through our predecessor to go in and provide medicine and provide medical care, especially in the remote rural areas in North Korea. We started working in what's known as the Free Economic Zone in Daesan, which is two main cities combined, Dajin and Sonbong, and the surrounding villages. And there, initially, you know, normally foreigners are not able to treat local patients, but right off the bat, my husband was given the opportunity to start treating local patients. And as a result, doors started to open for us. And so not only were we providing medical care and medicine to rural clinics in the area, but doors started to open for us to do other humanitarian work, especially for children in North Korea. So currently you'll see in this northeast region of North Korea, where China and Russia and North Korea meet, we were able to begin about 16 kindergartens and daycare centers to support food for the young children of North Korea, as well as begin about 6 rural clinics in remote fishing and farming villages. And so you can see here how our work has spanned across the different area of that free economic zone. But not only from, even though we started in humanitarian work, we were also giving opportunities to develop social entrepreneurship in North Korea. And this was primarily through a shoe manufacturing company. This shoe company was one of the first of its kind in that region. What's so great about that Northeast region is that it is open to social entrepreneurships and businesses from outside coming in to help develop the economy of North Korea. And we took advantage of this because my father-in-law actually is a shoe manufacturer for over 30 years. And so he had experience making shoes. And so when we started providing humanitarian assistance to the Northeast region, my father-in-law said, well, is there anything I can do? And as he started to come in and discuss with North Korean counterparts the potential of creating a shoe manufacturing company, they jumped on the chance because they had no such manufacturing company in their country. They were relying much upon imports from China. And so they were very eager to begin this project. And so what ended up happening is that we were able to employ over 40 people and provide steady jobs and regular food source for these families in these remote areas. Most of these workers are women. As Christine mentioned, the textile companies are mostly employ women. And so the vast majority of our employees that we support in the Northeast region are also women. But the news of what we were doing in the Northeast region started to travel down to the capital city of Pyongyang. And so when we made a trip to Pyongyang to just kind of figure out what the country is doing and try to understand a little bit more about the DPRK, we were actually invited to move to Pyongyang. And so I want to spend most of this time sharing with you about our main project, which is the Pyongyang Spine Rehabilitation Center in the very central part of Pyongyang, part of the campus of the Pyongyang Medical School Hospital, which is literally a 5-minute walk away from Kim Il-sung Square. So you can understand that it's literally in the center of the city. It's been such a privilege and such a journey for us to have this opportunity. But really, it didn't start by us going about planning on doing something like this. Our family, was just a humble humanitarian workers with a small organization. And when we first started going into North Korea, we felt like many of us feel, like we can't trust the North Koreans. We have to make sure that we verify everything. All our donations are going to the right source. And so instead of really being able to work together, we were fighting with our North Korean counterparts, fighting for them to, make sure that the goods went to the right place. But once we started to develop relationships after being inside of North Korea and realizing that, perhaps they know better than we do what their needs are, then a door started to open up for us to not only work in the Northeast region, but all the way to Pyongyang. This picture is one of our last trips into Pyongyang in 2017 as a family before the travel restriction. At that time, we only had 4 children. Currently, we have 5. But it was a sad day when, after 10 years of working in these relationships, finally developing trust, that we had to leave country. But the great thing about being introduced into Pyongyang was that up until that point, our kids had to homeschool. And now they had the opportunity to attend school at the Pyongyang Korean School for Foreigners. You'll see here, this is the picture of the entrance of the Korean School for Foreigners on the diplomatic compound in Munsu-dong in Pyongyang. And on the other side of the picture is actually our house, our apartment. We lived on the 5th floor across from the Polish embassy in the capital city. And our children then were able to attend school with approximately 25 other nationalities. Most of these children are diplomats children, but some of them are from large organizations such as the World Food Program, UNICEF, different UNDP, UN departments, but most of them come from embassies. But one of the shocking things for people to understand is that there are quite a few diplomatic relationships in North Korea, quite a few embassies. Many of them are small, but some of them are substantially large. And so this school is completely comprised of international students from around the world, but only about 50 students, kindergarten through 12th grade. And the teachers are all North Koreans, local teachers, but the education's done completely in English. And so, yeah, just realizing that there are countries with diplomatic relations in North Korea, that in itself can be quite shocking to American citizens. Even countries like the UK and France and Germany, as well as Sweden, have a presence inside North Korea. Today, I want to focus mostly, though, on our story of how we got involved in treating children with developmental disabilities in North Korea. As I mentioned, we didn't go into North Korea having this plan to developing a treatment and education system for children who have disabilities. But as we started to trust our counterparts and started to build relationships, doors slowly opened more and more. And one of these doors, as I mentioned, was for my husband as a rehabilitation doctor to treat children in North Korea. Well, we started treating patients in the Northeast region of Rasan. And then eventually, as we were invited to go to Pyongyang, one of the reasons we hesitated to take that offer up was because of this little girl named Pokshin. I want you to look closely at Pokshin because this is a real child in North Korea. And she, in this picture, is about 5 years old. She has or had a spastic quadriplegic cerebral palsy. She was unable to practically move any of her limbs voluntarily. She was even unable to chew her food. So the grandmother who's holding her in this picture, she would literally chew her food in her own mouth first, and then spoon that chewed food into her granddaughter's mouth and help her to swallow. And that is how Pokshin was able to sustain her life for those 5 years. Well, we asked the director of the Pyongyang Medical School Hospital for a bed for little Pokshin because we knew that when we moved to the capital city, that there would be no one to treat her in the Northeast region. Because doctors in North Korea, what they normally say to families who have children with developmental disabilities, they say, it's difficult enough for typical normal people to thrive in North Korea. So don't let your child suffer long. Let your child go quickly. And this is not something harsh. It is actually said out of compassion because everyone in North Korea is expected to participate in physical labor. And so if your child has any sort of disability, their value in the society goes down rapidly. And so they said, don't let your child suffer, let your child go quickly. It was a compassionate thing to say because they had no means or expertise to treat children with developmental disabilities. And so we had an urge to bring little Pokshin down to Pyongyang from the Northeast region so that we could continue to treat her and that she could continue to have hope for her future. So after some discussion, the medical school hospital director gave us consent to bring little Pokshin to Pyongyang. And soon, other mothers with other children with similar disabilities started to see little Pokshin being treated in the hospital. And they started to realize, you know, a child like my own is being treated in the hospital. I should bring my child too to receive treatment. And so pretty soon, mothers and their children started to line up outside the door of where we were treating children in the Pyongyang Medical School Hospital. And the Pyongyang Medical School director then came to us and said, I had no idea that this was such a big issue in our country. Let's do something about it. And so we started to develop for the first time in the nation an official treatment program for children with cerebral palsy and other developmental disabilities, as children from all around the nation, not just from the capital city, but from all different provinces, started to travel to Pyongyang for treatment in developmental disabilities. And it was about this time that a girl called YOON came to our center to be treated. Now, YOON at that time was 10 years old, and she also had spastic quadriplegic cerebral palsy, but her condition was a little bit less severe. She had more function in her limbs, but she had no coordination in that movement. And so YOON was unable to sit up at the time on her own or even walk. And so her teacher, having compassion on YOON in their little village, she would actually carry YOON on her back, piggyback her to school, walking to school every day. And she would place her in a chair at school and literally wrap her to the chair with a piece of rope, just so that YOON could sit into class and listen to lectures. Well, YOON came to our hospital to be treated, and she was one of our first patients. And it took quite a long time, as it does for all children with these kind of developmental disabilities. But YOON was treated for 11 months in our hospital. And when she was discharged, she was able to walk outside the hospital. And today, YOON is attending school and doing quite well in her classes. And the great thing about this story is not that just YOON's life was transformed from being able to have mobility, but it gave her a complete hope for her future and for her education. When YOON first came to us, we asked her, YOON, what is your dream? And she said, my dream is to walk to school with other children my age. Well, as she was walking outside the hospital, and in fact, the North Korean broadcasting company came and even broadcasted her discharge. We asked YOON again. We said, YOON, now what is your dream? And she said, my dream, looking straight at us, is to grow up and become a doctor like you so that I can treat patients like me. And that was a complete transformation from a child who had absolutely no future to a child now having a purpose for her life and knowing that she can make a difference for other children like her. There wasn't a dry tear in the place. Let me tell you, it was an incredible moment to witness in North Korea. Now that children are being treated in the hospital, one of the things that I started noticing as an educator was that many of these children, as YOON, had never had the opportunity to attend school properly. And so we had children who were 10, 16, sometimes even in their young adults in their 20s, come to us with developmental disabilities who had never attended school or very limited they received an education. And so they had never learned to read and write. As an educator, I started advocating for their education in North Korea. And as a result, we were able to begin the first educational therapy and special education department within our treatment program to teach children the basics of just reading and writing in their own language. It's quite ironic, but as a white American, I started to teach North Korean children how to read and write their own language. It was nothing short of a miracle. And so you can see this picture here. I'm actually giving an English lesson here, but there's now laughter where there once were tears in this room. And then on top of that, we also had a partnering physical therapist who was also trained in DIR floor time therapy, which is specific for therapy with children with autism. And so we began to not only work with children with cerebral palsy, but also children who have autism. And as you may know, autism is even more abundant worldwide. About 1% of all children are autistic. And so she was starting to develop a therapy program for children with autism. As you see in this picture, this boy is about 9 years old. He had never spoken before. He's nonverbal. But as she was doing therapy with him, playing with him, he said his first word in his life with this young lady in our therapy center. So now we're developing Pyongyang Spine Rehabilitation Center for both pediatric patients and other spine patients in the Pyongyang Medical School Hospital campus, as I shared. Thankfully, even though it took us about 3 years to receive all of our licenses, IGNIS Community has received OFAC U.S. Treasury license for this project, as well as multiple commerce license to ship medical equipment to the DPRK. And we have been fortunate enough to receive special validation passports from time to time. Our last trip inside North Korea was in December of 2019, right before COVID hit. And so now the interior of the hospital is complete, as well as the exterior, and we have shipments in progress. We already have the first installment of our shipment of medical equipment that's already been received in Pyongyang, and we're in the process of shipping our second medical shipment into the country. But the real focus of what we do is not just treating patients, but of course training doctors. Because it's only so good if we have to be there to treat the patients because we have the expertise. But if we train the doctors to be able to treat patients themselves, then this will really make an impact on the population in North Korea. And so we have 2 graduate specialties, one in pediatric, one just regular spine rehabilitation. These 2 specialties that we're developing with medical school graduates, training them in rehabilitation medicine. And we have, amazingly, we've been able to develop a contract with the Ministry of Public Health to develop these specialties in all 10 medical schools in North Korea, that's in all of the provinces of North Korea, as well as developing these pediatric rehabilitation programs in all of the provincial children's hospitals of North Korea. So doors have just completely opened to us for the entire nation, for every single province. And even though we're starting with the capital city of Pyongyang, the intention is to go into the entire nation. So as I mentioned, we've already begun pediatric rehabilitation centers in 3 provincial hospitals in Pyongyang Namdo, which is in Pyeongseong, just north of Pyongyang, and then in Nampo Children's Hospital, which is on the east coast in North Korea, and finally in Gangwon-do, which is in Wonsan. The city of Wonsan is on the, I'm sorry, Wonsan's on the east coast, Nampo's on the west coast. I always get this confused. But the two coastal cities of North Korea. And I just want to conclude with sharing this one Korean word, which is 회복, which means restoration. And in order for us, when we're looking at the Korean Peninsula, I think all of us have this heart to bring about restoration between the two countries, North and South Korea, but restoration with relationships with the United States, restoration of common people in North Korea, protecting their human rights, giving them a quality of life, providing the humanitarian assistance that they need. What we need is restoration. But as Dan already referred to, this has to be done, and Tim referred to this as well, this has to be done within a cultural understanding, within the cultural context. And so that has to be done in Asian societies, especially through relationships. If we do not engage in building relationships, then I think there's not a lot of hope for peace on the Korean Peninsula, not a lot of hope for progress in political relationships. It's engagement that is really the key. And I just hope that our short story, our little lives, short span of a little over 10 years in North Korea kind of gives you a glimpse of how just one organization, how we can go into North Korea and not even with intentions of doing everything we're able to accomplish, but as we build relationships in the country and as we get to know them on an individual basis, as we put a human face to what we're doing, we'll see that doors slowly and surely open up to us. And so our hope as Ignis community, of course, as a humanitarian organization, we want to see the quality of lives improve in North Korea, but we really want restoration on the entire peninsula of Korea. So thank you so much. It's been such a privilege.
Well, thank you very much, Joy. That is a remarkable work that you and your family have done. It really, it brings warmth to one's heart, to see great projects that are helping so many people, and the medical aspect of it, and as Dan mentioned, the agricultural aspect of relationships that are built with people of North Korea. You mentioned, most Americans probably don't realize there are diplomatic missions in North Korea, that the rest of the world has actually recognized North Korea. The United States is really the outlier where we do not have diplomatic relations, and we put such constrictions on people like yourself and Dan and Christine from going in, and Tim, to go in and have the relationships that really will blossom and will help the whole community, the whole U.S. community, say to our government, listen, you can't treat people like we've been treating them, that you can't keep sanctions on North Korea, you can't keep sanctions on Cuba, you can't keep all of these deadly sanctions on all of these countries. There are human beings that live there. And I think all of you all in your great presentations today have brought to us a much better understanding of the people of North Korea. I want to thank you all on behalf of Veterans for Peace for your time. We will be showing this, as I mentioned, on August 5th from 3 to 4:30 p.m. And we hope that if any of the four of you all are available at that time, that I'm sure we'll have some questions from our folks that are tuning in. If not, we will forward them to you, and hopefully we can have another session with them. So I want to thank you on behalf of Veterans for Peace for all of the work that you do for peace around the world, but particularly peace on the Korean Peninsula.